A recent academic journal article by a Harvard law professor, J. Mark Ramseyer, in which he describes the Korean and other women forced to sexual enslavement by the Japanese military leading up to and during World War II, had willingly entered into indenture contracts, has prompted an outcry among students and scholars all across the world. Now, in the realm of the academia, an international chorus of scholars across the U.S., Australia, Europe, and Asia called for the article to be retracted from the International Review of Law and Economics. Jeannie Suk Gersen, a tenured Harvard law professor, contributed the most comprehensive piece to date on the entire situation based on her own analysis, investigation, and correspondence with Professor Ramseyer himself. We have Professor Suk Gersen joining us live. Professor Jeannie Suk Gersen, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Now, first of all, I'd like to know what initiated you to pen this piece on The New Yorker.
I started to look into it because I was asked to write a response to Ramseyer's article by the journal itself. And so after I had studied the article and looked at what his arguments were, I, of course, did not have the ability to trace his sources because many of them were in Japanese. So I consulted with some other scholars who are scholars of Japanese. Some of them are at Harvard, and a couple of them decided that they were also going to write a response. And so as they were looking into it and trying to find the sources so that they could interpret them for themselves, they found that Ramseyer had not cited any sources that actually took the reader to actual contracts with Korean women. There were contracts with Japanese women, but not with Korean women. And there were not any other sources, whether secondary sources or third-party sources, that would enable one to actually examine contracts that may have existed between Korean women and any other party regarding comfort stations. So given that that was what they found, the scholars decided that they were going to ask for a retraction from the journal, mainly because it does not comport with professional scholarly standards.
As you just mentioned, there are various aspects of Professor Ramsey's article that outright ignores decades of historical evidence compiled by Korean and Japanese historians, and there are, I suppose, problems with his scholarship. But this is a legal piece. As from a legal perspective, is it an acceptable legal paper?
I would simply say that a contract is not properly called a contract. It's not really an actual legal contract if the agreement is a product of coercion or force or deception. And so I think the basic factual matter is, were these arrangements reached through force, coercion, or deception? And I think the weight of scholarly evidence, the very overwhelming weight of scholarly evidence, based on decades of historical research by professional historians, is that these were forcible, coercive, and duplicitous arrangements that in which Korean women and women from all over Asia and beyond were taken against their will. And so to call these contracts is inaccurate. And so I think from a legal perspective, Professor Ramseyer can only make this claim if he does not believe the accounts of force and coercion. And that's why it was important that the historians actually look into the sources to see if there were, in fact, sources that would indicate that any of these arrangements were voluntary. And in order to keep an open mind about that, you have to actually really look. And they did, and they found that there were no such sources, at least that he had found, and they were not aware of any either.
Now, this is not an article, written by any student or college freshman. Professor Ramseyer is an academic of with decades of experience on his sleeves, and he's a professor of, of one of the most recognized academic institutions in the world. In your New Yorker piece, as a fellow professor at Harvard Law, you two know each other and you've spoken with him on this matter. What was his response to this whole controversy?
I have spoken with him several times on the matter, as I indicated in my New Yorker article. His response was that in some places he had made errors. He did say to me, and I did report in the New Yorker, that he said in some instances there were errors. There were errors of citation. There were errors also of looking at sources and saying something that it didn't actually say. I think he has admitted those errors to me, as I described in my New Yorker article. I do not know what his view is of the fact that there are no sources that can show the terms of the contracts, because I tried to have some more conversations with him, and he said that he would explain himself in his own time.
Despite the outcry of pouring in by students and scholars from all across the world, and of course from professors at Harvard, including yourself, of course, Harvard itself remains silent. Do you think it's important for Harvard to step up and issue a statement of some sort? Do you think there will be one?
Well, Harvard is a university that does not take political positions and that does not take positions on whether somebody's scholarship is good or bad. And I think that because I feel completely free to criticize Professor Ramseyer and make any other criticisms or to make any kind of statements that I wish to make, including being on this news show. And so for that reason, I would say that the real responsibility is on the scholarly community. And it has done its job. It is doing its job in the way that I think is very good, that they have really taken it upon themselves, the individual scholars and groups of scholars working together to look at the issue, look at the scholarly responsibility, and to point out the flaws. That's what scholars are supposed to do. So I don't see it as Harvard University's place to tell any of us scholars that our scholarship is unacceptable.
Fair enough. Jeannie Suk Gersen, professor of law at Harvard Law, many thanks for speaking with us and speaking up on this issue. Thank you so much.
Thank you.